Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from the loneliest hearts. And sometimes love finds a way to return when you need it most. Deep in the Montana wilderness, an old mountain man named Elias Rourke found 4 helpless wolf cubs crying beside their dead mother. He could have walked away, but something in those tiny whimpers reminded him of his own abandoned childhood. So he fed them, raised them, and loved them until they grew strong enough to return to the wild. 20 years passed. Elias grew old and grey, thinking those wolves had forgotten him completely. Then one cold evening, armed men surrounded his cabin, demanding the gold he'd spent his life mining. They had guns and cruel intentions. But as the sun set behind the pines, 4 shadows emerged from the forest. What happened next proved that some bonds can never be broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the memory of a dream, and Elias Rourke stood on his cabin porch, watching the sun paint the Montana peaks in shades of amber and rose. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising between fingers that had known more calluses than comfort. At 73, his beard had turned the color of winter snow, but his eyes, pale blue as glacial ice, still held the sharpness of a man who'd learned to read danger in the whisper of wind through pine needles. The cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering evergreens, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and a lifetime away from the world that had forgotten men like him. He'd built it with his own hands 40 years ago, when Margaret was still alive, and her laughter could chase away the shadows that sometimes crept into his mind during the long mountain winters. Those shadows came more frequently now, but he'd made his peace with solitude. In his shirt pocket, wrapped in soft deer hide, lay a small wooden cross he'd carved for Margaret's grave. He touched it now, a habit born of 20 years of widowhood, feeling the smooth edges worn down by countless fingers seeking comfort. She'd understood his need for the wilderness, his inability to tolerate the noise and crowds of town life. "You were born wild, Elias Rourke," she'd told him once, tracing the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from Vietnam. And wild things need space to breathe. The scar ached now in the cold morning air, a reliable barometer that had predicted weather better than any almanac for 5 decades. Today it spoke of coming storms, though the sky showed nothing but endless blue. Elias had learned to trust such warnings. In the war, and in the years since, his life had often depended on reading signs others missed. He sipped his coffee and remembered the day that changed everything. 20 years passed, but vivid as yesterday's sunset. He'd been checking his trap lines in the high country near Black Elk Pass, where the wind carved strange songs from the rock formations. The snow had been deep that March, and he'd been following what he thought were deer tracks when he heard it, a sound that stopped him cold, crying. Not human, but close enough to make his chest tighten with an emotion he'd thought long buried. He'd found them huddled against their mother's still form, 4 tiny wolf cubs no bigger than house cats, their eyes barely open, whimpering in voices that seemed to reach straight through his ribs and squeeze his heart. Their mother lay twisted in a cruel steel trap, her beautiful silver coat matted with frozen blood. Around her neck, almost hidden in the thick fur, was a weathered leather collar bearing the initials J.R., a detail that puzzled him then and haunted him still. Most men would have walked away. Wolves were predators, dangerous when grown. The sensible thing would have been to leave nature to its course. But as Elias knelt beside those helpless creatures, something cracked open inside him, a reservoir of tenderness he'd thought had died with Margaret. Their tiny paws were already blue with cold. Their cries growing weaker, he'd scooped them up, all 4 fitting easily in his coat. Their small bodies trembling against his chest as he carried them home through the deepening snow. For 3 days, he'd fed them warm milk from a baby bottle he'd driven 20 miles to town to buy, telling the curious store clerk it was for orphaned kittens. He'd made them a nest by his fireplace, watching over them through sleepless nights as they grew stronger. Shadow was the first to open his eyes. pale yellow like his mother's, intelligent and watchful. Storm and Frost came next, identical twins with coats dark as midnight, their personalities fierce and playful. Ember was the smallest, a silver-grey female who seemed to understand human emotion with an almost supernatural perception. She'd crawl into his lap during those first weeks, her tiny form radiating warmth against the loneliness that lived in his bones. As spring arrived and the cubs grew, Elias found himself talking to them like they were children. He told them about Margaret, about the war, about the emptiness that had settled over his life like permanent winter. They listened with tilted heads and bright eyes, never judging, never pulling away when the memories made his voice crack. He taught them to hunt, starting with rabbits and gradually working up to deer. But more importantly, he taught them to fear humans, all humans except him. "Men are dangerous," he'd tell them during their evening walks. "Most would shoot you on sight. Trust no one but me, you understand?" They seemed to comprehend, keeping their distance whenever his rare visitors appeared. For 2 years, they lived together in a bond deeper than he'd ever imagined possible. They slept by his fireplace in winter, hunted with him in summer, and filled the hollow spaces in his heart with a love both fierce and gentle. But as they reached maturity, the call of the wild grew stronger. One autumn morning he woke to find them gone. All 4 vanished into the endless wilderness like smoke on the wind. He'd searched for days, calling their names until his voice gave out, but found only paw prints leading deeper into the mountains. The logical part of his mind knew this was natural, even necessary. Wild things belonged in the wild. But the human part, the part that had grown to love them like his own children, felt their absence like a physical wound. Now, 20 years later, Elias finished his coffee and stepped off the porch to begin his morning routine. The Gold Creek called to him, its voice promising another day of honest work. He'd discovered the vein 2 months ago, following a promising glint in a tributary that fed into Clearwater Creek. The find was modest but steady enough to supplement his pension and provide for his simple needs. The walk to the creek took 15 minutes through forest that knew his footsteps like an old friend. Towering pines whispered secrets overhead, while chipmunks chattered warnings of his approach. A red-tailed hawk circled lazily above the canopy, riding thermals that carried the scent of pine sap and mountain snow. At the creek, Elias set up his simple operation, a wooden sluice box he'd built himself, a pick and a pan worn smooth by countless hours of use. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Scoop, sift, examine, discard. Each pan held the possibility of fortune, though he'd learned long ago that the real treasure wasn't in the gold itself, but in the peace it brought him. By noon, he'd collected enough flakes to fill a small vial, perhaps $20 worth at current prices. Modest but consistent. Over the past 2 months, his secret hoard had grown to nearly $5,000 in raw gold, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his cabin. Enough to worry about if the wrong people found out. The nearest town, Copper Falls, lay 12 miles down a winding mountain road. Once a week, Elias made the journey in his battered pickup truck to sell small amounts of gold and buy supplies. He was careful to vary the dealers he visited, never selling enough to attract attention. But small towns had long memories and loose tongues. News traveled fast, especially news about an old hermit finding gold in the high country. Last week, he'd noticed a stranger in Murphy's bar, a hard-faced man with eyes like broken glass, asking casual questions about local prospectors. The bartender, Mickey O'Brien, was a good friend who'd served Elias coffee and conversation for 20 years. But Mickey liked to talk, especially after a few drinks, and Elias worried that loose words might find their way to the wrong ears. The afternoon sun was slanting low when Elias returned to his cabin, his day's work complete. He climbed the porch steps with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints protested every movement, pausing to survey his small kingdom. The cabin was solid, built to last, with thick log walls and a stone chimney that drew smoke clean and straight. A vegetable garden sprawled beside the house, mostly dormant now in the approaching winter. Behind the cabin, a small shed housed his truck and tools. It wasn't much, but it was his. A place where a man could live according to his own rhythms, unbothered by the noise and haste of modern life. Margaret had loved it here, spending hours on the porch with her embroidery, humming old songs while hummingbirds visited the flowers she'd planted. Inside, the cabin was sparse but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by bookshelves filled with westerns, military histories, and Margaret's romance novels. A simple kitchen occupied the back corner, and a narrow staircase led to the loft where he slept. The walls held few decorations, a faded wedding photo, his military commendation, and Margaret's needlework samplers with their cheerful messages about home and love. As darkness fell, Elias prepared his evening meal, venison stew from his own hunting, biscuits baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven, and black coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He ate in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Owls called from the darkness, while somewhere in the distance, a coyote pack raised their voices in wild harmony. After dinner, he settled into his reading chair with a worn copy of Louis L'Amour's The Daybreakers, the fire crackling softly beside him. But tonight concentration proved elusive. His mind kept drifting to the stranger in Murphy's bar, to the feeling of being watched that had plagued him lately. Twice this week, he'd found boot prints near his creek that weren't his own. Small signs, easily dismissed, but they nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. Perhaps it was the approaching winter making him jumpy. The first snows would come soon, sealing him into his mountain fortress for months. Usually, the prospect brought comfort, a season of solitude and simple survival. But this year felt different. The very air seemed charged with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. He touched the wooden cross in his pocket and wished, not for the first time, that Margaret were here to chase away his worries with her gentle wisdom. She'd always known how to calm his restless spirit, how to find light in the darkest corners of his mind. Without her, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound. Outside, the wind picked up, setting the pine boughs to singing their ancient songs. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, life continued, its eternal dance of predator and prey, survival and death. Elias had found his place in that order long ago, content to be neither hunter nor hunted, but something in between. A man who'd learned to read the forest's moods and live by its harsh but honest rules. He closed his book and banked the fire, preparing for another night in the home he'd built with love and defended with stubborn pride. Tomorrow would bring another day of simple work and quiet satisfaction. The gold would still be there, waiting in the creek bed like buried treasure. His small hoard would grow, dollar by dollar, flake by precious flake. But as he climbed the stairs to his loft bedroom, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming to his mountain sanctuary. Something in the wind carried whispers of danger, and his old soldier's instincts were stirring after years of peaceful sleep. He'd survived worse storms than whatever was brewing now, but at 73, he wondered if his luck and his strength would hold for one more battle. In the darkness of his bedroom, he lay listening to the night sounds until sleep finally claimed him. His dreams were filled with shadows moving through the trees and the echo of wolf howls on the wind, sounds that might have been memory or might have been something more. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the first frost had painted the high meadows silver. Elias was working a new section of Clearwater Creek, following a promising quartz vein that disappeared into the stream bed like a golden highway leading to fortune. His back ached from hours of bending over the sluice box, but the steady accumulation of flakes in his pan kept him motivated despite the bite of autumn air. Then his pick struck something that rang like a bell. He knelt in the shallow water, ice-cold current numbing his hands as he cleared away gravel and sediment. What emerged made his breath catch in his throat, a nugget the size of a robin's egg, heavy and pure, gleaming like captured sunlight in his weathered palm. In 40 years of prospecting, he'd never seen anything like it. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, his voice lost in the creek's babble. The nugget was just the beginning. Over the next 2 hours, working with the fevered intensity of a man half his age, Elias uncovered a pocket of gold unlike anything in his experience. Not just flakes and dust, but chunks and nuggets, some weighing an ounce or more. By the time exhaustion forced him to stop, he'd filled a coffee can with treasure worth more than his cabin. The walk home felt different, charged with the electric tension of a life suddenly transformed. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. Every sound carried potential threat. The coffee can felt heavy as lead in his backpack, its contents worth more than most men saw in a year. For the first time since moving to the mountains, Elias found himself looking over his shoulder. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with the gold spread before him like pieces of a broken sun. Conservative estimates put the value at $15,000, enough to live comfortably for years, or to buy luxuries he'd never imagined needing. But wealth had never been his goal. The gold represented something more dangerous than money. It represented change, attention, and the end of the peaceful anonymity he'd spent decades building. He gathered the precious metal into a leather pouch Margaret had sewn for him years ago, originally intended for fishing tackle. The irony wasn't lost on him. She'd made it to hold the tools for catching dinner, not the means to change their lives forever. He secreted the pouch beneath the loose floorboard, where he kept his modest savings, then sat back to consider his options. The smart thing would be to say nothing, to work the claim slowly and quietly, selling small amounts in distant towns where his face wasn't known. But autumn was fading into winter, and once the snows came, he'd be trapped until spring. That left him perhaps 3 weeks to extract what he could before the creek froze solid. Sleep came hard that night, broken by dreams of golden rivers and shadowy figures lurking at the edges of consciousness. When morning arrived grey and cold, Elias felt aged beyond his years, as if the weight of hidden treasure had settled into his bones overnight. The next few days blurred together in a haze of back-breaking work and mounting paranoia. He varied his routine, taking different paths to the creek, working at odd hours, always watching for signs of unwanted company. The claim yielded more gold than he dared hope, nearly $25,000 worth by his rough calculations. But each nugget felt like a step closer to disaster. On Friday, necessity forced him into town for supplies. Copper Falls looked the same as always, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around the main street like settlers circling their wagons. Murphy's Bar sat across from Miller's General Store, both institutions older than most of the people who patronized them. But today, the familiar streets felt different, charged with an undercurrent of danger that made Elias's old combat instincts stir. At Miller's, he bought coffee, flour, and ammunition with cash from his pocket, avoiding the gold entirely. Mrs. Miller, a plump woman with kind eyes and gossip for a tongue, chattered about the weather and the early hunting reports while she rang up his purchases. "You doing all right up there all by yourself, Elias?" she asked, genuine concern coloring her voice. "Sam Henderson was saying he heard blasting from your direction last week." Elias kept his expression neutral. "Just clearing some deadfall with dynamite. A tree came down across my access road." She nodded, apparently satisfied, but he caught her glancing at his hands that bore fresh calluses and scratches from his recent labors. In a small town, people noticed such things. They remembered them too. At Murphy's Bar, the afternoon crowd was thin. A few local ranchers nursing beers and discussing cattle prices, old Pete Kowalski playing solitary checkers in the corner. Mickey O'Brien polished glasses behind the bar, his Irish face creased in its perpetual half-smile. "The usual, Elias?" Mickey asked, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Just coffee today." Elias settled onto his regular stool, scanning the room from habit. "Quiet afternoon." "Aye, that it is. Though we had some excitement earlier." Mickey poured the coffee, black and strong. "Stranger came through asking questions about local prospectors. Professional type, if you know what I mean." Elias felt ice form in his stomach. "Questions about what specifically?" "Oh, the usual nonsense. Claims, territory, who's working where." I told him what I'd tell all the tourists. Most of the gold played out 50 years ago, and what's left ain't worth the trouble of hauling equipment up the mountain. This stranger have a name? Mickey's expression darkened slightly. Called himself Greta. Marcus Grettir. Had the look of a man who'd done hard time, if you ask me. Eyes like a snake, and questions too specific for casual curiosity. The name meant nothing to Elias, but the description sent warning bells clanging in his mind. He sipped his coffee and tried to appear disinterested while his thoughts raced. Did he say where he was staying? Rented a room at the Pine Lodge, but checkout was this morning. Could be long gone by now. Mickey leaned closer, lowering his voice. Between you and me, Elias, that one had the smell of trouble about him. You might want to keep an eye out, living alone up there like you do. Elias finished his coffee and left money on the bar. Thanks for the warning, Mickey. I'll be careful. The drive home felt like the longest 12 miles of his life. Every curve in the mountain road might hide an ambush. Every shadow could conceal watching eyes. His truck's engine seemed louder than usual, announcing his presence to anyone within miles. By the time he reached his cabin, Elias's nerves were stretched taut as piano wire. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a boot print in the soft earth beside his porch. Too large to be his own and too fresh to be old. His front door stood slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd locked it before leaving for town. Drawing the Colt 45 he'd carried since Vietnam, Elias approached his home, like the combat veteran he'd never stopped being. The cabin had been searched, professionally, but not perfectly. His belongings were disturbed just enough to suggest someone had gone through them, looking for something specific. The loose floorboard over his hiding place remained undisturbed, but only because whoever had searched didn't know where to look. Yet on his kitchen table, weighted down with a river stone, lay a folded piece of paper. Elias opened it with steady hands, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The message was brief and to the point. "Old man, we know about the gold. Smart thing would be to pack up and leave. Tonight. Don't make this harder than it has to be. MG." He read it twice, then crumpled the paper and tossed it into the fireplace. The flames consumed it quickly, but the threat remained, hanging in the air like smoke. Marcus Grettir, whoever he was, had made his intentions clear. This wasn't a negotiation or a bluff. It was an ultimatum delivered by someone with the resources and ruthlessness to back it up. Elias checked his weapons. The Colt 45, a 12-gauge shotgun, and an old M1 rifle from his army days. Enough firepower to make a stand, but against how many men? And for how long? At 73, he couldn't run, couldn't hide, and couldn't fight the way he once had. The mountain that had been his sanctuary was becoming his tomb. As darkness fell, he moved through his cabin systematically, checking locks, loading weapons, and preparing for whatever the night might bring. Every sound outside, wind in the pines, an owl's call, the distant howl of coyotes, might herald the approach of armed men with murder in their hearts. But beneath the fear and preparation, something else stirred in Elias Rourke's chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in 20 years, not since he'd said goodbye to 4 young wolves and watched them disappear into the wilderness. It was the peculiar loneliness of a man who'd lived too long without family, who faced his final battle with no one to mourn his passing. In the darkness outside his windows, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly, vast and indifferent to human concerns. Somewhere in that trackless expanse, life continued its eternal patterns, predator and prey, hunter and hunted, the strong surviving while the weak fell away. Elias touched the wooden cross in his pocket and whispered a prayer to a God he wasn't sure still listened to old soldiers and hermits. Then he settled into his chair with the shotgun across his knees, prepared to defend what was his until the last breath left his body. The game had begun, and there was no turning back. Dawn broke grey and cold, painting the mountain peaks in shades of pewter and ash. Elias had dozed fitfully in his chair, the shotgun never leaving his hands, startling awake at every creak of settling timber or whisper of wind through the eaves. His back ached from the uncomfortable position, but he was alive, more than he dared hope when night fell. The immediate threat hadn't materialized, but that brought little comfort. Men like Greta didn't make idle threats, and they rarely worked alone. If anything, the quiet night suggested they were watching, waiting, choosing their moment with the patience of experienced predators. Elias rose stiffly and moved to the kitchen window, scanning the tree line for movement. The forest looked innocent enough in the pale morning light, but 40 years in these mountains had taught him to read subtler signs. A jay's harsh cry from the wrong direction, the absence of squirrel chatter near his woodpile, small things that suggested his sanctuary was no longer entirely his own. He needed help, but his options were limited. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and involving civilians would only put innocent people at risk. The sheriff's department was headquartered in Billings, nearly 100 miles of mountain roads that might as well have been on the moon. By the time law enforcement arrived, any evidence of wrongdoing would have vanished along with Elias himself. That left his old military contacts, men who'd shared foxholes and firefights in a war most people preferred to forget. But as he rifled through his address book, reality struck him like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, his old squad leader, had died of cancer 3 years ago. Bill Kowalski had succumbed to a heart attack the previous winter. Tommy Chen, his radio operator, was fighting Alzheimer's in a VA hospital in Seattle. Time, it seemed, had been a more effective enemy than the Viet Cong. His fingers found one last entry, written in fading ink: Bobby Clearwater, Missoula. Robert Clearwater had been the youngest member of their unit. Barely 18 when he'd arrived in country with scared eyes and hands that shook when he thought no one was looking. But combat had a way of separating the wheat from the chaff, and Bobby had proven himself a dozen times over before shrapnel from a mortar round sent him home early. Elias reached for his landline phone, then stopped. The dial tone was dead. Not surprising, given how often mountain storms knocked out service, but suspicious under the circumstances. He tried his cell phone and found the same result. No signal, no connection to the outside world. They'd cut him off deliberately, severing his links to help before making their move. Professional work, the kind that suggested military or law enforcement training. Elias felt a grudging respect for his enemies, even as his situation grew more desperate. Outside, he circled the cabin systematically, looking for signs of tampering. He found the telephone line first, cleanly cut with wire snips about 50 yards from the house, the severed ends hidden beneath fallen pine needles. The cell tower that served this area was visible from his back porch, a metal framework rising above the tree line 5 miles away. Whether they'd sabotaged it or simply used electronic jamming equipment, the result was the same. The isolation that had been his refuge was now his prison. Back inside, Elias opened an old wooden chest that had followed him from Vietnam to Montana, through marriage and widowhood, war and peace. Beneath his army dress uniform, still pressed and ready for the funeral he expected to wear it to, lay memories wrapped in oiled cloth. He unwrapped them carefully, medal ribbons that spoke of courage under fire, commendation letters from commanding officers, and photographs of young men who'd grown old or died trying. At the bottom of the chest, in a small leather pouch Margaret had sewn, he found what he was looking for. A tiny collar, no bigger around than a coffee mug, made from supple deer hide and decorated with small brass studs. He'd crafted it himself during those first magical weeks when the wolf cubs were learning to walk. Their legs still wobbly with youth, the smallest cub, Ember, had worn it for exactly 1 day before wiggling out of it with the determined persistence of a creature born to be free. He'd kept it anyway, a memento of the brief time when he'd been a father figure to something that needed him. Now holding it again after 20 years, the memories flooded back with painful clarity. He remembered Shadow, the leader even as a pup, those intelligent yellow eyes seeming to understand every word Elias spoke. Storm and Frost, the twins, wrestling together by the fireplace while snow piled deep outside. And Ember, the smallest and smartest, who'd learned to open cabinet doors and steal socks to chew, leaving a trail of cotton destruction that made him laugh despite himself. For 2 years, they'd been his family. Not replacements for the children he and Margaret had never had, but something uniquely precious. Wild things that had chosen to trust him, to accept his love and guidance before answering their deeper calling. Teaching them to hunt had been like watching his own children take their first steps. Seeing them grow strong and confident had filled empty spaces in his heart he hadn't known existed. But teaching them to fear humans had been the hardest lesson of all. Too many wolves died each year because they lost their natural wariness, approaching campers or hunters who saw only predators to be eliminated. So he'd brought strangers to the cabin, delivery men, distant neighbors, the occasional lost tourist, and showed the cubs how to vanish into the forest at the first sign of human scent. Men are dangerous, he told them over and over, speaking the words like a prayer or a curse. Most would shoot you on sight. Trust no one but me, you understand? Trust no one but me. The training had worked perhaps too well. When the time came for them to leave, they'd simply melted into the wilderness without a goodbye, following instincts older than civilization. He'd searched for weeks, calling their names until his voice gave out, but found only paw prints, leading deeper into the mountains where even he couldn't follow. Now, alone in his cabin with enemies closing in, Elias wondered if those lessons had condemned him to die friendless. Had he been too successful in teaching them to avoid humans? Would they remember him after 20 years of wild freedom? Or had their wolf nature finally overcome the bond forged in puppyhood? The afternoon light was fading when he heard the first truck engine in the distance, its rumble echoing off the valley walls. Then another and another, multiple vehicles approaching his isolated home with the deliberate precision of a military convoy. Elias checked his weapons one last time and took position at his front window, watching as his peaceful sanctuary transformed into a battlefield. 3 pickup trucks emerged from the forest, moving slowly up his access road in single file. They stopped just beyond rifle range, their occupants remaining hidden behind tinted windows and steel doors. Waiting, watching, making their presence known without exposing themselves to return fire. The psychological warfare had begun. Elias touched the tiny collar in his pocket, a talisman from a time when love had been stronger than fear, when 4 small lives had depended on his protection. He'd saved them once, raising them from helpless infancy to magnificent adulthood. Now facing his own mortality, he wished with all his heart that somehow, impossibly, they might save him in return, but wishes were for children and fools. And Elias Rourke had been neither for a very long time. He was a man alone, surrounded by enemies, with nothing but his own skill and determination to see him through the coming storm. The wolves were gone, and the ghosts of memory could offer only comfort, not salvation. The standoff stretched through the remainder of that day and into the night, a deadly game of patience played by men who understood that time could be as effective a weapon as bullets. The 3 trucks remained positioned beyond rifle range, their occupants invisible but undoubtedly watching. Occasionally, Elias caught the glint of sunlight on binoculars or a rifle scope, reminders that he was a mouse being studied by cats. As darkness fell, floodlights mounted on the vehicles illuminated his cabin in harsh white beams, turning his sanctuary into a stage where every movement was visible to hostile eyes. The message was clear. They owned the night now, and privacy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Elias moved through his home by feel and memory, keeping away from windows while he prepared what defenses he could. Years of military training came flooding back as he created firing positions, cleared fields of fire, and inventoried his ammunition. The old soldier in him noted the tactical situation with grim professionalism. Multiple attackers, superior numbers, high ground advantage to the enemy. Not impossible odds, but far from favorable. In the basement, he retrieved items that hadn't seen use since Vietnam. Tripwires, improvised explosive devices made from dynamite and fishing line, and the kind of booby traps that had kept him alive in jungle firefights half a century ago. His hands moved with muscle memory as he rigged the most obvious approaches to his cabin, turning his home into a fortress that would exact a price from any assault. But even as he worked, part of his mind dwelled on the mystery of his attacker's knowledge. They'd known about his gold discovery with suspicious precision, arriving within days of his big strike. That suggested either surveillance equipment or inside information. Neither possibility offered much comfort. The morning brought answers, delivered in the form of two men who emerged from the lead truck carrying a white flag fashioned from a dish towel. They approached to within shouting distance, their hands visible, but their intentions unclear. One was tall and lean, moving with the predatory grace of a natural killer. The other was shorter, stockier, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent hard years under harsh suns. Elias Rourke, the tall one called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "My name is Marcus Greta. I believe you received my message." Elias positioned himself behind the reinforced window frame. He'd prepared the M1 rifle steady in his hands. "I got it. My answer is no." Greta's laugh was cold as winter wind. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, old man. We're not unreasonable people. Walk away now and you keep breathing. Simple as that. And if I don't, then we take what we came for anyway and you become fertilizer for these pretty pine trees." Something in Greta's voice triggered a memory, not of words, but of timbre and cadence. A voice from the distant past, younger but carrying the same cruel undertones. Elias studied the man through his rifle scope, noting the weathered features, the confident posture, the way he held himself like someone accustomed to violence. "Do I know you?" Elias called back. The pause was telling. "Ancient history, Rourke. Let's focus on the present." But Elias was already digging deeper into memory, following threads that led back decades to a time when these mountains knew different footsteps. Bounty hunters had been common then, men who killed wolves for government payments, predator control they called it. Most had been local ranchers supplementing their income, but some had been professionals, hard men who traveled from state to state, following the money and leaving trails of carcasses in their wake. "Marcus Greta," he repeated slowly, testing the name against old recollections. "You set traps in Black Elk Pass 20 years ago. Steel traps that caught more than you bargained for." This time, the pause stretched longer. When Greta spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, recognition mixed with something that might have been respect. "Well, I'll be damned." The old hermit with the soft spot for wolves. "I wondered what happened to those cubs you stole from me." The pieces clicked together, like rounds sliding into a magazine. The dead mother wolf with the mysterious collar, JR, probably from some previous victim. The professional precision of the trap placement. The way Greta's men moved with military discipline despite their civilian appearance. "You're the one who killed their mother," Elias said. "Not a question, but a statement of fact. Business is business, Rourke. Wolf bounties were good money back then, before the Bleeding Hearts changed the laws. That bitch was worth $200 to the state of Montana, and you cost me the payment. So this is personal. This is practical. You've got gold, and I've got expenses. The fact that you interfered with my work 20 years ago just makes it more satisfying." Elias felt something shift inside him. Not fear, but a cold clarity that reminded him of combat. This wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about justice, karma, the universe finally balancing its books. The man who'd orphaned 4 helpless cubs had returned to claim another prize. But this time his prey wasn't defenseless. "You made a mistake coming here. Greta, the only mistake was waiting this long. You should have died in that cabin 20 years ago, old man. I'm just correcting an oversight. The negotiation was over." Both men understood that words had served their purpose, not to reach an agreement, but to confirm what each suspected about the other. This was personal now, blood calling to blood across 2 decades of buried history. Greta and his companion retreated to their vehicles, but not before Elias caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. In the back of the middle truck, barely visible beneath a canvas tarp, lay surveying equipment and what looked like mining gear. These weren't just thieves or claim jumpers. They'd come prepared for a full-scale operation, ready to strip his mountain bare once he was out of the way. In his shirt pocket, wrapped in oiled leather, lay his old military dog tags, strips of metal that had identified his body for burial in a dozen different countries where young Americans died for causes they barely understood. He'd carried them through Vietnam, through the long years of peace that followed, through marriage and widowhood and the slow decline of age. Now, facing what might be his final battle, those tags felt heavier than their modest weight suggested. They were more than identification. They were proof that he'd once been a soldier trained to kill and taught to survive against impossible odds. That training had saved his life many times over the years, and now it might have to do so again. As night fell once more, Elias settled into his defensive position with the patience of a man who'd learned to wait for the right moment to strike. Outside, his enemies prepared their own strategies, confident in their numbers and superior position, but what none of them knew, what Elias himself could barely dare to hope, was that other eyes might be watching from the darkness beyond their floodlights. Wild eyes that remembered kindness, predator eyes that could distinguish between friend and enemy with lethal precision. In the vast Montana wilderness, shadows were beginning to move. The psychological warfare began at dawn, with the sound of chainsaws echoing through the forest. Greta's men were cutting down trees, not randomly, but with calculated purpose, clearing sightlines, eliminating cover, methodically stripping away the natural advantages that might favor a defending force. The message was unmistakable. They had time, resources, and the patience to do this properly. Elias watched from his fortified position as his sanctuary was systematically violated. Ancient pines that had weathered centuries of storms fell before gas-powered blades, their death cries lost in the mechanical roar. Each fallen giant felt like a personal wound, another piece of his peaceful world, sacrificed to human greed and cruelty. But the trees weren't the worst of it. Around noon, one of Greta's men approached the cabin carrying something dark and lifeless. He deposited his burden on the front porch with theatrical ceremony. A young deer, throat cut, blood still fresh on its spotted coat. The animal had been killed recently and cleanly, not for food, but for effect. An hour later came a fox, its red fur matted with gore. Then a rabbit, then 2 squirrels arranged in a grotesque tableau. Each death was a message. This is what happens to things that live on this mountain. This is what awaits you if you continue to resist. Elias felt bile rise in his throat as he watched the carnage accumulate. These weren't men defending their territory or fighting for survival. They were sadists who enjoyed inflicting pain on the helpless. The kind of people who pulled wings off flies as children and graduated to bigger prey as adults. He thought of the wolf cubs he'd raised, remembering how they'd played with such innocent joy, chasing each other through meadows of wildflowers while he watched from his cabin porch. The idea of these same animals falling victim to Greta's cruelty made something dangerous stir in his chest. Not fear, but a cold rage that reminded him why he'd been such an effective soldier. The afternoon brought visitors to town, or rather the absence of visitors. Word had spread somehow that something was happening up at the old hermit's place, and the good people of Copper Falls were making themselves scarce. No delivery trucks rumbled up the mountain road. No lost tourists stopped for directions. Even the mail carrier, reliable as sunrise for 30 years, failed to make his rounds. Fear was contagious in small communities, spreading faster than wildfire and just as destructive. By evening, Elias's isolation was complete, not just physical, but social and psychological. He was a man alone, cut off from help, facing enemies who seemed to anticipate his every move. The night brought new horrors. Greta's men took turns with a bullhorn, reading from what sounded like prepared scripts. They described in graphic detail what they would do to him once they breached his defenses. They speculated about how long an old man could last under interrogation. They made promises about his death that would have made hardened soldiers blanch, but beneath the psychological torture, Elias sensed something else: impatience. For all their professional preparation, these weren't military men accustomed to siege warfare. They were criminals used to quick scores and easy targets. The longer this dragged on, the more nervous they would become. And nervous men made mistakes. He used their impatience against them, firing occasional shots to keep them honest, not aimed to kill, but close enough to remind them that their prey still had teeth. Each shot sent them scrambling for cover, disrupting their routines and fraying their nerves. It was a dangerous game, conserving ammunition while maintaining the illusion of strength. But it bought him time to think. The real breakthrough came near midnight, when silence fell over the clearing like a heavy blanket. The bullhorn ceased its taunts. The floodlights dimmed. Even the engines that had run constantly for 2 days finally went quiet. In that silence, Elias heard something that made his heart skip, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. A wolf howl, distant and mournful, drifting down from the high peaks where the snow never melted. Then another, from a different direction. And another. They were out there. He moved to his back window, the one facing away from Greta's position, and listened with the intensity of a man whose life depended on interpreting every sound. The howls came again, closer now, forming a rough circle around the clearing. Not random wolf song, but something more purposeful, communication, coordination, the kind of pack behavior that suggested intelligence and intent. In his vest pocket, alongside the wooden cross and dog tags, Elias carried another memento of those precious 2 years, a large canine tooth, yellowed with age, but still sharp enough to draw blood. It had come from the cub's mother, pulled from her jaw after Greta's trap had claimed her life. He'd kept it as a reminder of nature's beauty and mankind's capacity for cruelty. Now, holding it in his weathered fingers, he felt its weight, like a promise or a prayer. The mother had died protecting her young, falling victim to human greed and callousness. But her children had survived, grown strong, learned the lessons he'd taught them about trust and loyalty and the bonds that transcended species. Shadow, he whispered into the darkness, speaking the name for the first time in 20 years. Storm, frost, ember, I know you're out there. I know you remember. The response came not as sound, but as sensation, a shift in the atmosphere, a change in the night's rhythm that spoke to instincts older than civilization. Something was moving in the forest, something large and purposeful, circling the clearing with predatory patience. Greta's men sensed it too. Elias could hear them talking in urgent whispers, their earlier confidence replaced by nervous energy. Floodlights swept the tree line randomly, searching for threats they couldn't identify. Someone chambered around with unnecessary force, the metallic sound carrying clearly across the clearing. They were afraid. For the first time since this nightmare began, Elias allowed himself a moment of hope. Not rescue. He was too old and practical to believe in fairy tale endings. But perhaps, if he was very lucky and very careful, he might not die alone. Perhaps the bonds forged in love and sealed with trust might prove stronger than the hatred that had brought these killers to his door. In the darkness beyond the artificial lights, wild hearts were stirring. The pack had returned to protect their own, just as he had once protected them when they were small and helpless and utterly dependent on his care. The night suddenly seemed less dark, less lonely, less hopeless than it had just moments before. Elias checked his weapons one more time and settled in to wait for whatever dawn might bring. He was no longer alone in the wilderness. Dawn brought evidence that the night had been anything but quiet. Elias woke from a doze to find something that made his breath catch in his throat, a smooth river stone, perfectly round and polished by countless years of mountain streams. Sitting on his front porch, like an offering from the wilderness itself, he knew that stone. 20 years ago, the smallest of the cubs, little Ember, silver-grey and wise beyond her months, had carried it everywhere, dropping it at his feet when she wanted attention, worrying it between her paws during long winter evenings by the fire. It had been her treasure, her comfort, the one constant in a young life marked by loss and confusion. Now it sat before his door, placed there by paws he couldn't see, a message more profound than any human language could convey. They remembered. They had not forgotten the man who fed them, protected them, loved them, when the world had shown them only cruelty. Elias picked up the stone with trembling fingers, feeling its familiar weight, its sun-warmed surface that spoke of patient years in mountain streams. Ember had been the most perceptive of the cubs, the one who seemed to understand human emotion with an almost supernatural clarity. If she had left this token, it meant more than simple recognition. It meant the pack understood his situation and had chosen to act. But the stone brought more than hope. It brought a crushing weight of responsibility that settled on his shoulders like lead. These wolves had survived 20 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth, dodging hunters, trappers, and the 1,000 natural dangers that claimed so many of their kind. They had families now, territories to defend, lives that extended far beyond their connection to one aging human. By revealing themselves, by choosing to involve themselves in his battle, they were risking everything they had built. If something happened to them, if Greta's men managed to kill them in the coming conflict, their blood would be on his hands as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself. "Don't do this," he whispered to the forest, clutching the stone to his chest. "You don't owe me anything. You're free now. Stay free." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were futile. The bonds forged in those first desperate months, when 4 orphaned cubs had depended on him for survival, ran deeper than human understanding. This wasn't about debt or obligation. It was about family, pack loyalty, the kind of connection that transcended species and defied rational explanation. Across the clearing, Greta's men were stirring with obvious unease. Their earlier confidence had evaporated during the night, replaced by the jittery nervousness of predators who'd suddenly realized they might be prey. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones. Weapons were checked and rechecked with obsessive frequency. Eyes constantly scanned the tree line, searching for threats that remained frustratingly invisible. The first concrete sign of trouble came around mid-morning, when one of Greta's sentries began calling for his partner. The man's voice carried increasing urgency as he searched the perimeter, eventually escalating to outright panic. A search party formed quickly, armed men moving in tight formation toward the spot where the missing guard had last been seen. They found his rifle first, a high-powered scope mounted on a military-style assault weapon, lying abandoned beside a massive pine tree. The man himself was discovered 20 yards away, unconscious but breathing, with no apparent injuries beyond a knot on his skull and the kind of disorientation that spoke of a professional takedown. Elias watched through binoculars as the soldiers, for that's what they were, despite their civilian clothes, examined the scene with growing alarm. The missing man's story, when he finally regained consciousness, was fragmentary and confused. Something had struck him from behind. He'd caught a glimpse of yellow eyes in the darkness. There had been no sound, no warning, just sudden blackness and the sensation of falling. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. These were hardened men who'd faced human enemies in conflicts around the world, but this was different. An opponent that moved without sound, struck without warning, and vanished like smoke in the wind. The unknown was always more terrifying than the familiar. And right now, their enemy was completely unknown. Greta himself emerged from the command truck to survey the situation, his weathered face grim with concentration. Even at this distance, Elias could see the tension in the man's posture, the way his eyes constantly moved as he tried to assess a threat he couldn't quantify. This wasn't how the operation was supposed to unfold. The old hermit was supposed to be isolated, helpless, easy prey for professional killers. Instead, they found themselves in a tactical nightmare, surrounded by an enemy they couldn't see, fighting a battle on terrain that grew more hostile with each passing hour. The mountain that had seemed like their ally was turning against them, harboring forces that moved by rules they didn't understand. As afternoon wore on, the harassment continued. Equipment disappeared from unguarded vehicles. Radios, ammunition, even personal gear vanished as if claimed by the forest itself. Sentries reported movement in their peripheral vision, But investigation revealed nothing but empty trees and shadows that seemed to shift when no wind was blowing. The most unnerving incident came near sunset, when the camp's food supplies were discovered scattered and destroyed. Not eaten, destroyed. Cans punctured by what looked like claw marks, packages torn open, and their contents distributed across a wide area. It was a message written in the universal language of predators. This is our territory now, and you are not welcome here. Elias felt a mixture of pride and terror as he witnessed the pack's strategy unfold. They were using tactics he'd taught them 20 years ago: patience, stealth, the psychological advantage of the unseen hunter. But they'd refined those lessons with 2 decades of wild experience, adding layers of sophistication that turned simple harassment into a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The deadline Greta had set was approaching: 48 hours to abandon his claim and disappear forever. Tomorrow would bring the final assault, the moment when words gave way to bullets and the long standoff erupted into open violence. Tonight was likely his last chance to escape, to slip away in the darkness and leave this mountain to its new masters. But escape had never really been an option. This was his home, his sanctuary, the place where he'd shared his happiest years with Margaret and his most profound connection with the wild creatures that had adopted him as family. To run now would be to abandon everything that gave his life meaning. In his pocket, Ember's stone sat warm against his chest, a talisman from a time when love had conquered fear, and 4 small lives had depended on his protection. Now, as darkness gathered around his mountain fortress, that same love was returning to protect him, not because they owed him anything, but because some bonds were stronger than death itself. The final night was beginning, and with it would come the ultimate test of everything he'd taught them about loyalty, courage, and the terrible price of standing against evil in a world that often rewarded cowardice and cruelty. The revelation came with the harsh glare of floodlights and the metallic click of weapons being readied for action. Greta strode across the clearing with the confidence of a man who'd finally decided to end a game that had gone on too long. Behind him walked 6 armed figures, moving with the practiced coordination of a military unit. But it was what Greta carried in his hands that made Elias's blood turn to ice, an old steel trap, its jaws crusted with ancient rust, and something darker that might have been blood. The same type of trap that had killed the wolf mother 20 years ago, but this one bore additional modifications. Scratches and dents that spoke of frequent use, serial numbers filed away to prevent identification, and a patina of age that suggested decades of deadly service. "Recognize this, Rourke?" Greta called out, holding the trap high enough for Elias to see clearly. "Been carrying it around for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to show it to you." Elias felt the bottom drop out of his world as pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't just the same type of trap. This was the exact trap that had orphaned 4 helpless cubs and set in motion the chain of events that led to this moment. Greta hadn't just been a bounty hunter working these mountains. He'd been specifically hunting the pack that became Elias's family. "You kept it," Elias said, his voice carrying across the clearing with the weight of accumulated years and suppressed rage. "A professional always keeps his tools," Greta replied, "especially the successful ones. This beauty here has claimed more wolves than any other trap in Montana." 47 confirmed kills over 15 years, including several breeding pairs that would have produced dozens more vermin if left unchecked. The casual cruelty in his voice was staggering, but it was what came next that truly shattered Elias's understanding of the past 2 decades. "The funny thing is," Greta continued, his weathered face splitting into a cold smile, "I wasn't even hunting that particular bitch for the bounty. She'd killed my partner." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "What?" "Jake Rutherford, best tracker I ever worked with. We'd been following that pack for 3 weeks, getting closer every day. Then one morning I found him torn apart beside our camp, his throat ripped open, claw marks on everything. That silver wolf had hunted him down and executed him like he was nothing more than prey. Greta's voice carried the bitter satisfaction of a man settling an old score. So when I finally cornered her in Black Elk Pass, it wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice. An eye for an eye, as the good book says. Elias felt his worldview shifting like tectonic plates, everything he thought he knew about that long-ago tragedy rearranging itself into a new and terrible pattern. The wolf mother hadn't been an innocent victim caught in an indiscriminate trap. She'd been a specific target, hunted by men who had their own reasons for wanting her dead. "You're lying," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, doubt was creeping in like poison. "Am I?" "Think about it, old man. Why do you think that pack was so far from their usual territory? Why was the mother traveling alone with cubs when wolves almost never separate from their pack during whelping season?" "She was running, Rourke!" Running from the consequences of what she'd done. The psychological impact was devastating, calculated to shake Elias's faith in everything he'd believed about his relationship with the wolves. If their mother had truly been a killer, if she'd murdered an innocent man, then what did that make the cubs he'd raised? What did it make him? But even as doubt gnawed at his confidence, another part of his mind, the part trained in combat and hardened by years of survival, was analyzing Greta's story for weaknesses. Something didn't ring true about the timeline, the details, the convenient way it painted the wolves as villains and the bounty hunters as victims. "Show me proof," Elias demanded. Greta reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but still legible. He held it up, letting the floodlights illuminate what appeared to be an official report. Sheriff's investigation into Jake's death. Cause of death, animal attack, consistent with large predator. Case closed. He folded the paper and tucked it away. Course, there's parts of the story the official report doesn't tell. Private details between partners. What kind of details? The smile that crossed Greta's face was ugly as a fresh wound. The kind that explained why we were really in these mountains, and why that wolf had such a personal grudge against poor Jake. Elias waited, knowing that whatever came next would either vindicate his faith in the creatures he'd loved or destroy it completely. "We weren't just hunting wolves for bounties, old man. We were suppliers. There's a market for live wolves, private collectors, research facilities, people with exotic tastes in pets. The bounty was pocket change compared to what we could get for a healthy breeding pair. The truth hit Elias like a sledgehammer. You were trappers, poachers. We were businessmen meeting market demand. And we were damn good at it until that bitch figured out what we were doing. She'd been watching us, learning our patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. When she found Jake alone at our camp, she took her revenge. So you murdered her. I executed a killer. And I would have gotten those cubs too, if some bleeding heart hermit hadn't interfered." Greta's voice hardened. "Been thinking about that for 20 years, wondering what happened to Jake's killers. Imagine my surprise when I finally tracked down the man who'd stolen them, only to discover he'd been sitting on a fortune in gold this whole time. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, revealing a picture far more complex and morally ambiguous than Elias had ever imagined. The wolf mother hadn't been an innocent victim. She'd been an avenger, striking back at men who'd stolen and enslaved her kind. Her death had been both murder and execution, depending on which side of the moral equation you chose to occupy. "The cubs," Elias said quietly. "They don't know any of this." "Oh, but they do." Greta's smile turned predatory. "Wolves pass down knowledge through generations, old man. Pack memory. Those cubs you raised grew up knowing their mother died avenging their father, who we caught and sold to a research facility in Nevada. They know exactly who I am, and they know what I represent." The revelation was staggering in its implications. For 20 years, Elias had wondered why the wolves had vanished so completely, why they'd never returned to visit the man who'd saved their lives. Now he understood. They'd been watching, waiting, planning. Their mother's death hadn't just been a tragedy. It had been the opening shot in a war that was only now reaching its conclusion. "That's why they're here," Greta continued. Not to save you, but to finish what their mother started. To settle the blood debt that's been hanging over this mountain for 2 decades. Elias looked out at the dark forest surrounding his cabin, seeing it now not as sanctuary, but as a battlefield where ancient grievances were finally coming due. Somewhere in those shadows, 4 grown wolves were positioning themselves for a confrontation that had been 20 years in the making. "You should have walked away," he told Greta. "Can't do that, old man. See, this mountain holds more than just your gold. It holds the answers to questions that have been eating at me for 20 years. Tonight, I finally get to meet the children of the wolf that killed my partner. Tonight, I finish what that trap started." Greta raised his weapon, not the assault rifle Elias had expected, but something far more sinister. A tranquilizer gun, designed to subdue rather than kill. "Because this time," he said with cold satisfaction, "I'm taking them alive." The trap had been set not just for Elias, but for the wolves themselves. And now, with night falling and the final confrontation at hand, everyone involved in this 20-year-old tragedy was finally gathering in the same place, drawn together by bonds of love, loyalty, and the kind of hatred that could only be satisfied with blood. The trees around Elias's clearing bore fresh scars, deep gouges in the bark that spoke of claws and territorial marking, messages written in a language older than human civilization. As darkness deepened, these markings became more visible, catching the harsh glare of Greta's floodlights like ancient runes carved in living wood. Elias recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same system of territorial markers he'd observed 20 years ago, when the cubs were learning to hunt, a complex communication network that allowed pack members to coordinate without sound or sight. But these marks were different, deeper, more deliberate, arranged in configurations that suggested not just presence, but strategic positioning. They were surrounding the clearing. From his fortified position inside the cabin, Elias could read the story told by those claw marks as clearly as if it were written in his native language. Storm had marked the eastern approach, his scratches forming the distinctive parallel lines that had always been his signature. Brass marks appeared on the southern trees, slightly shallower but more numerous, reflecting the patient, methodical nature that had made him the pack's most successful hunter. Shadow's territorial claims dominated the western tree line, bold, deep gouges that proclaimed the presence of an alpha male in his prime. But it was the northern markers that made Elias's heart clench with recognition. Ember's marks were smaller, more delicate, but positioned with the tactical precision that had always set her apart from her brothers. She was coordinating the others, serving as the strategic mind behind what was clearly a carefully planned operation. "Smart girl," he whispered into the darkness, remembering the tiny cub who'd learned to open cabinet doors and steal his socks. Now she was orchestrating a military-style operation that would have impressed his old army commanders. Greta's men had noticed the markings too, their earlier confidence crumbling as they realized the psychological implications. They were no longer the hunters, they had become the hunted, surrounded by predators that knew this terrain better than any human ever could. The floodlights that had been intended to eliminate shadow and concealment now worked against them, creating a bright island of visibility while the darkness beyond remained impenetrable. Elias watched through his rifle scope as Greta moved among his men, clearly trying to maintain discipline and morale. But even at this distance, the strain was showing. These were hardened mercenaries who'd fought in conflicts around the world, but this was different from any enemy they'd ever faced. Humans could be predicted, their tactics analyzed and countered. Wolves operated by different rules entirely. The first probe came just after midnight, not an attack, but a test. Something large moved through the trees beyond the southern perimeter, visible for just a moment in the spillover from the floodlights. Greta's men reacted immediately, swinging their weapons toward the movement, fingers tense on triggers, but there was nothing there. Whatever they'd seen had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. leaving only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the increasingly frayed nerves of men who were beginning to understand they were outmatched. "Steady," Greta's voice carried across the clearing. But Elias could hear the tension beneath the calm exterior. "They're just animals, big dogs with sharp teeth. Nothing we haven't handled before." But his men weren't buying it anymore. They'd all heard the stories, the legends that surrounded wolf packs in this part of Montana. Ghost wolves, some called them, predators that moved like smoke and struck like lightning, vanishing back into the wilderness before human eyes could track their movement. 20 minutes later, the probe came from the east. This time, multiple shapes flickered through the trees, there and gone so quickly that the watching soldiers might have imagined them. But the territorial markings on the nearby trees began to glow with phosphorescent intensity, some trick of reflected light that made them seem alive in the darkness. Elias smiled grimly as he recognized the tactic. The cubs had learned early that psychological warfare could be as effective as physical violence, that fear could paralyze an enemy more completely than any weapon. They were using their mythical reputation against Greta's men, allowing imagination to do most of the work while they positioned themselves for the final strike. The third probe came from the north, and this time there was no mistaking what the soldiers saw. A massive wolf, silver-gray in the artificial light, stood at the very edge of the illuminated area for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be seen, identified, remembered. Then it was gone, leaving behind only the echo of its presence and the growing certainty that death was stalking through the Montana wilderness. "Ember," Elias breathed, recognizing the intelligent yellow eyes that had watched him with such understanding all those years ago. She was no longer the tiny cub who'd needed his protection. She was an apex predator in her prime, fully grown and utterly lethal, but she was also still his little girl, the smallest of the 4 who'd crawled into his lap during winter storms and listened to his stories with the patience of a wise old soul. The recognition was mutual for just an instant before she vanished. Those yellow eyes had looked directly at his window, acknowledging the man who'd given her life and teaching her to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. Greta was losing control of his men. Elias could see it in their body language, the way they clustered together for mutual protection instead of maintaining their assigned positions. Fear was contagious, and it was spreading through the group like wildfire. Some were arguing with their leader, gesturing toward the vehicles with obvious desire to abandon this cursed place. But Greta himself seemed energized rather than intimidated by the wolves' presence. He moved among his men with renewed purpose, checking weapons, adjusting positions, preparing for a battle he'd been anticipating for 2 decades. This wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about settling old scores, completing unfinished business, proving that human intelligence and technology could triumph over natural instinct and wild cunning. "Listen up," he called to his troops, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "I know what you're thinking. Big scary wolves, mysterious movements in the dark, all that folklore bullshit. But here's what you need to remember. These aren't supernatural monsters. They're animals. Flesh and blood, just like us." He held up the tranquilizer gun again, its sleek lines reflecting the harsh light. "And tomorrow, when the sun comes up, we're going to capture every one of them, alive. Do you have any idea what a trained wolf pack is worth on the exotic animal market? We're talking about retirement money, gentlemen. Enough to buy our own tropical islands. Some of the mercenaries seem to take comfort in this mercenary motivation, but others continued to cast nervous glances at the tree line. They'd signed up to intimidate an old hermit, not to capture supernatural predators that had become local legends. Elias felt sick at the thought of his wolves spending their remaining years in cages, performing tricks for the entertainment of wealthy collectors, or enduring medical experiments in sterile laboratories. These creatures had been born free, raised free, and lived free for 20 years in some of the most beautiful wilderness on Earth. To see them reduced to commodities in Greta's twisted marketplace would be worse than seeing them killed outright. As the night wore on, The psychological pressure continued to mount. The wolves maintained their invisible presence, never quite showing themselves, but making their proximity known through sound, scent, and the kind of environmental disruption that spoke to instincts older than consciousness. Greta's floodlights began to seem less like protection and more like targets, marking their position for predators that could see perfectly well in the dark. Around 3 in the morning, one of the mercenaries cracked. Elias watched through his scope as the man threw down his weapon and began walking toward the vehicles, ignoring Greta's shouted orders to return to his position. 2 others followed, abandoning their posts in favor of the psychological safety of steel and glass. Greta drew his sidearm and fired a shot into the air, the sharp crack echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. "The next man who abandons his post gets a bullet in the back," he roared. "We came here to do a job, and by God we're going to finish it." The defectors stopped, caught between their fear of the wolves and their fear of their leader. But their hesitation told its own story. Greta's authority was fracturing under the pressure of an enemy he couldn't intimidate or control. From the darkness beyond the lights came a sound that raised the hair on every man's neck, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was joined by another, then another, until the night resonated with the promise of violence. 4 voices speaking in harmony, announcing that the time for games had ended. The pack was ready to attack. Elias checked his weapons one final time, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the magnificent creatures he'd raised from helpless infancy. They'd come back to protect him, just as he'd once protected them. And now all of them were caught in a web of violence and revenge that had been spinning for 20 years. The final battle was about to begin, and there would be no quarter asked or given. This mountain had seen enough blood and suffering. Tonight, one way or another, the old debts would finally be paid in full. The attack began with silence, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, a quality of stillness that spoke to ancient instincts buried in human DNA. The night sounds that had provided constant background noise throughout the siege simply stopped. No owl calls, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, no whisper of wind through pine needles. Even the insects fell quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath before the storm. Elias felt it first as a change in air pressure, the way his scarred temple always warned him of approaching weather. But this was different, more immediate, more personal. Something was moving in the darkness beyond Greta's floodlights. Something large and purposeful and absolutely silent. Shadow stepped into the light like a materialization of death itself. The alpha wolf moved with liquid grace, his massive frame rippling with muscle beneath a coat that gleamed silver-black in the artificial illumination. He was larger than Elias remembered. 20 years of wild living had transformed the playful cub into an apex predator weighing nearly 200 pounds. His yellow eyes reflected the harsh lights with an intelligence that was almost human in its intensity. For a moment, wolf and men stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey, sizing up their respective strengths. Then Shadow took another step forward, his massive paws making no sound on the pine needle carpet. Greta's men reacted with the trained reflexes of professional soldiers, weapons swinging toward the threat, fingers tightening on triggers. But their leader's sharp command stopped them from firing. "Trank guns only," Greta shouted, his voice tight with excitement rather than fear. "Remember what they're worth alive." The alpha wolf tilted his head at the sound of human voices, a gesture so familiar that Elias felt his heart clench with recognition. Shadow had always been the most curious of the cubs, the one who listened most intently when Elias spoke, as if trying to decode the mysteries of human language through sheer force of will. Now that intelligence was focused on Greta with laser intensity, yellow eyes cataloging threats, measuring distances, calculating angles of attack. This wasn't the random aggression of a wild animal. This was a tactical assessment being conducted by a mind that understood warfare at a level most humans never achieved. The first tranquilizer dart took Shadow in the shoulder, the sharp crack of the compressed air gun echoing across the clearing. The massive wolf staggered, but didn't fall, his enhanced metabolism already working to process the sedative. He turned toward his attacker with a snarl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. That's when the real attack began. Storm erupted from the eastern tree line like black lightning, moving faster than human eyes could track. The mercenary who'd fired the dart had time for exactly one startled shout before 200 pounds of wolf muscle slammed into his chest, driving him backward into the darkness beyond the lights. Frost appeared simultaneously from the south, his approach so silent that the nearest soldier didn't realize death was stalking him until massive jaws clamped around his rifle barrel, steel teeth shearing through metal like it was cardboard. The weapon disintegrated in the wolf's grip, leaving the man holding useless fragments while predator eyes studied him with cold calculation. But it was Ember who truly demonstrated the pack's evolved intelligence. While her brothers created chaos and confusion at ground level, she materialized on higher terrain, somehow having scaled the rocky outcropping that overlooked the clearing from the north. Her position gave her perfect sight lines on the entire battlefield, allowing her to coordinate the attack with tactical precision that would have impressed human military commanders. A low bark from her position sent Storm melting back into the shadows, his target neutralized but alive, unconscious and bleeding but breathing. Frost released the destroyed rifle and padded silently to his next objective, a communications specialist who was frantically trying to call for backup on equipment that had been sabotaged hours earlier. The pack was hunting with surgical precision, eliminating threats in order of priority while leaving escape routes open for those wise enough to take them. This wasn't random animal aggression. It was a carefully orchestrated operation designed to achieve specific objectives with minimal casualties. Greta seemed to recognize this even as his careful plans disintegrated around him. "They're not just attacking," he called to his remaining men, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and fury. "They're thinking, planning, working together like Shadow's charge cut off his words." The Alpha had shaken off the effects of the tranquilizer through sheer force of will, his massive frame moving with deadly purpose as he closed the distance to his primary target. Greta raised his weapon. But Shadow's approach was a study in tactical brilliance, weaving, dodging, using abandoned equipment and fallen logs as cover while he closed the gap between predator and prey. The bounty hunter's second dart went wide as Shadow leaped, his trajectory carrying him over a disabled vehicle and directly toward the man who'd killed his mother. For one frozen moment, wolf and human stared into each other's eyes across 20 years of accumulated hatred. Then they collided in a tangle of claws, teeth, and desperate human screaming that echoed off the mountain walls like the sound of justice finally being served. The coordinated precision of Frost and Storm's attack unfolded like a deadly ballet, choreographed by nature itself. The twin wolves moved in perfect synchronization, not the random aggression of wild animals, but the calculated teamwork of predators who had spent 2 decades perfecting their hunting partnership. Frost took the left flank, his dark form flowing between abandoned vehicles and scattered equipment like liquid shadow. Storm mirrored his movements on the right, creating a pincer formation that would have impressed any military tactician. But it was their silent communication that truly set them apart. Subtle shifts in posture, brief eye contact, the kind of wordless coordination that spoke to a bond deeper than human understanding. They had learned this dance from Elias himself, during those precious months when he taught them to hunt as a pack rather than as individuals. But 20 years in the Montana wilderness had refined their technique beyond anything their human teacher could have imagined. They moved with the lethal efficiency of apex predators in their prime, each step calculated to maximize their advantage while minimizing risk to themselves and their packmates. Their first target was a communications specialist who'd been trying desperately to call for backup on sabotaged equipment. Storm approached from his blind spot, moving so silently that the man's first indication of danger was the sensation of hot breath on his neck. When he spun around, he found himself staring into yellow eyes that reflected intelligence, patience, and absolutely no mercy. The man's scream died in his throat as massive jaws closed around his rifle, steel teeth shearing through the weapon's barrel with a sound like breaking bones. Storm didn't hurt him, didn't need to. The demonstration of power was enough to send the communications specialist scrambling toward the vehicles, abandoning his post and his mission in favor of simple survival. Frost's approach to his target was even more theatrical. The second twin materialized directly in front of a heavily armed mercenary, sitting calmly on his haunches like a domestic dog waiting for a treat. The incongruity was so jarring that the soldier actually lowered his weapon, confusion overriding trained reflexes. That moment of hesitation was all Frost needed. He rose to his full height, nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, and released a low growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The mercenary's nerve broke completely. He threw down his tranquilizer gun and ran, crashing through the underbrush with the desperate panic of prey that had finally recognized its predator. But the twins' true masterpiece was their coordination with Ember, whose elevated position allowed her to direct their movements with tactical precision. A sharp bark from the rocky outcropping sent Storm flowing toward a cluster of soldiers who'd taken defensive positions behind their vehicles. A different vocalization, more of a howl than a bark, redirected Frost toward a sniper who thought his concealed position made him invisible. The pack was communicating in a language that blended learned human tactics with instinctive wolf behavior, creating something entirely new, a hybrid form of warfare that leveraged the best of both species. They were no longer just animals following instinct, nor were they attempting to be human. They had become something uniquely their own, shaped by love and training and 2 decades of wild evolution. Elias watched this deadly symphony unfold from his fortified position, his heart swelling with pride even as bullets began to fly around his cabin. These magnificent creatures had taken everything he'd taught them about survival and strategy and transformed it into something beautiful and terrible. They were protecting him, yes, but they were also avenging their mother, settling old scores, balancing the moral equation that had been skewed for 20 years. The remaining mercenaries were beginning to understand that they faced an enemy unlike anything in their experience. These weren't rabid animals to be put down. They were intelligent adversaries who thought, planned, and adapted their tactics in real time. The psychological impact was devastating, turning hardened soldiers into frightened men who jumped at shadows and fired at phantoms. Greta's voice cut through the chaos, harsh with desperation and growing fury. "They're just animals," he screamed at his retreating forces. "Big dogs with sharp teeth. Stand your ground and fight." But his men weren't listening anymore. The careful discipline that held mercenary units together was fracturing under pressure that none of them had trained for. They'd signed contracts to intimidate an old hermit, not to battle supernatural predators that seemed to read their thoughts and anticipate their every move. Storm and Frost pressed their advantage, herding the remaining soldiers away from the cabin and toward the vehicles where escape remained possible. This wasn't about killing, it was about dominance, territory, the kind of message that apex predators had been sending for millions of years. The mountain belonged to the pack now, and human trespassers would be tolerated only as long as they remembered their place in the natural order. As the last of Greta's soldiers broke and ran, abandoning their leader to face the consequences of his 20-year obsession alone, the twins turned their attention to the real battle taking place at the center of the clearing. Shadow and Greta were locked in mortal combat. Predator and prey, finally settling accounts that had been 20 years in the making. Dawn came slowly to the Montana mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that reminded Elias of happier times. The battle was over, silence settling over the clearing like snow after a storm. Greta lay motionless beside his abandoned equipment. His 20-year quest for revenge finally ended. Shadow stood over him, massive chest heaving. Yellow eyes still bright with the fire of justice served. The alpha wolf looked older now, bearing the weight of leadership and the scars of survival that marked every creature who'd lived long enough to earn respect in the wilderness. But when those ancient eyes turned toward Elias's cabin, time seemed to fold back on itself. And for one magical moment, he was again the curious cub who'd listened to bedtime stories by the fireplace. Elias emerged from his fortress slowly, his old bones protesting every movement. The clearing looked like a battlefield from some forgotten war, abandoned vehicles, scattered equipment, the detritus of human ambition left to be reclaimed by the forest. But the wolves were there, all four of them, waiting with the patience that had always marked their kind. Storm and Frost flanked their alpha, dark coats gleaming in the morning light, their eyes bright with intelligence and something that might have been satisfaction. They'd grown magnificent in their wild years, powerful predators who commanded respect from every creature in these mountains. But they still carried themselves with the confidence he'd taught them as cubs, the certainty that they belonged wherever they chose to stand. Ember approached first, moving with the delicate grace that had always set her apart from her larger brothers. She was smaller than the males, but no less impressive, her silver-grey coat rippling with muscle beneath fur that caught the early light like spun moonbeams. When she stopped just beyond arm's reach, Elias could see his own reflection in those intelligent yellow eyes. "Hello, little girl," he whispered, using the same gentle tone he'd employed when she was small enough to fit in his coat pocket. "You came back." Her response was a sound he'd almost forgotten. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something uniquely hers that had always meant contentment, recognition, love. She moved closer, close enough for him to see the grey threads around her muzzle that marked her advancing years. Close enough to catch her scent that blended wild freedom with memories of puppy breath and warm milk. When she touched her nose to his outstretched hand, 20 years of separation collapsed into nothing. She was his little girl again, the runt of the litter who'd stolen his socks and learned to open cabinet doors, the clever one who'd understood human emotion with supernatural clarity. But she was also a mature alpha female, a force of nature who commanded her own territory and answered to no authority but the ancient laws of the pack. Shadow approached next, his massive frame moving with careful deliberation. When he reached Elias, the great wolf lowered his head in a gesture that was part greeting, part submission to the man who'd been his first pack leader. Elias reached out with trembling fingers to touch the powerful neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath thick fur. "You remember," he said wonderfully. "After all these years, you remember." The reunion was brief but profound, each wolf acknowledging their debt to the man who'd given them life when the world had shown them only cruelty. But wild hearts belonged in wild places, and as the sun climbed higher, Elias could see restlessness creeping into their posture. They had territories to defend, mates to protect, the eternal responsibilities of apex predators in an unforgiving world. One by one, they began to withdraw. Storm and Frost first, melting back into the forest with the silent grace that had always marked their movements. Shadow lingered longest, those intelligent eyes seeming to memorize every detail of the man who'd shaped his earliest memories. Then he too was gone, vanishing into the wilderness like smoke on the wind. Ember was last, as she'd always been the most reluctant to leave his side. But before she disappeared into the trees, she deposited something at his feet. 4 offerings arranged in a neat line on the cabin's front porch, river stones, smooth and perfectly round, each one polished by countless years in mountain streams. Not unlike the stone she'd carried as a cub, but larger, more significant. Gifts from the high country, where few humans ever traveled, tokens of gratitude from hearts that understood debt and loyalty and love. Elias knelt beside the stones with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. In the morning snow that had begun to fall, he could see 4 sets of paw prints leading away from his cabin. Not the chaotic scramble of flight, but the measured departure of family saying goodbye. They were leaving him tokens of their presence. Proof that the bonds forged in love and sealed with sacrifice could transcend species, survive decades of separation, and endure even in a world that showed little mercy to the gentle of heart. The sound of approaching vehicles broke his reverie. The sheriff's department, finally responding to reports of gunfire in the mountains. They would have questions, official forms to fill out, investigations to conduct. But the real story would remain between him and the wilderness, written in a language of loyalty and love that most humans could never understand. As the law enforcement convoy wound up his access road, Elias gathered the stones and carried them inside, placing them on his mantelpiece beside Margaret's photograph. 4 perfect stones from 4 perfect friends. Reminders that family came in many forms, and love could conquer even death itself. Outside his window, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly, vast and beautiful and alive with possibilities. Somewhere in that trackless expanse, 4 magnificent wolves were returning to their own lives, carrying with them the knowledge that they'd honored their debt and protected the man who'd given them everything when they had nothing. The mountain was peaceful again, but it would never be lonely. Love had come home, if only for a moment, and that was enough to sustain an old man's heart through whatever winters still awaited him. In the forest, wild hearts ran free, and the circle was finally complete.